I'm going to talk about some solutions, what to do with externalities. Like, going back to Mankiew's principles, in most cases, markets, usually markets are a good way to organize economic activity, okay? When I say usually, really the conditions for that include no externalities. Then Mankiew's next principle was, but sometimes the government can improve on market outcomes. And one of the situations where the government could is when there are externalities. And the government solutions mainly fall into two types, either controls or by changing the prices. Okay, um, so controls. The government might mandate a maximum level of pollution, okay, that a firm is allowed to create. This has been one strategy for dealing with pollution, pollution emissions. In cars, for example, the government simply says, "Thou shalt not have a car that pollutes more than a certain amount." Um, let's see. If we believe that, I mean, okay, yeah. So here's something that comes up between me and one of my good friends. Okay, drugs. Okay, and I'm not talking about the pharmaceutical kind. I'm talking about the fun ones right now. Okay, um, illicit drugs. Um, okay, so these are things, marijuana, heroin, LSD. Okay, now, um, uh, whether drugs need to be regulated really depends on like three things, and so my position is markets are usually markets are usually a good way to externalities to organize economic activity, except when there are externalities, problems with information, or market power. Okay, and uh, I don't know. You, so to me, any argument for regulating drugs, saying that we should not have a free market for drugs, should fall into one of these categories. Again, if there are no problems with information, no externalities, and no problems with market power, a market economy can't be beaten. Okay, so I do acknowledge maybe information is a problem. Okay? Information about risks or how addictive something is, maybe that's a problem. Okay. Um, uh, maybe there are externalities associated with drug use. Um, you know, Alcohol, for example, it's not an illicit drug, but alcohol consumption causes violence. It causes car crashes. It causes a variety of things that impact other people. Uh, Maybe you know opioids have an impact on families, or addiction in general impacts families, and so even marijuana consumption, if it results in any type of addictive behavior, that's something that's detrimental to the family. Or maybe people just don't like it when dad is zoned. Why did I say dad? Um, Zoned out all the time. Someone in the family is zoned out all the time on marijuana. Um, and maybe that's damaging to the family members. Okay. So under this, so then we have a couple of options how to handle these things. And one option is control. Pass a law limiting consumption of these things. Um, setting a maximum quantity that a person can consume of alcohol or marijuana or whatever else. Okay. Essentially, this is what laws do for these illicit drugs, setting that maximum quantity at zero. Okay. Prohibition would be an example of setting the maximum quantity for alcohol at zero. Now, so that's what I mean by those are examples of controls on consumption. And as I said, this is one way to deal with things that create negative externalities. The flip side, oh, by the way, another example of controls, we talked about smoking causes, or secondhand smoke causes a negative externality, whether it's your health or just it smells bad. And one way in which smoking has been controlled is, for the most part, smoking is not allowed inside public buildings in virtually every location in the US. Okay? Back when I was a kid, when you went into a restaurant, the first thing that the family was asked was smoking or non-smoking section. Okay? People would sit in restaurants and smoke. When my grandmother was with us, we would sit in the smoking section so she could do her chain smoking throughout the meal. Just smoke, smoke, smoke right in our face. And it's again, it creates a negative externality, not just for us, but for neighboring tables. So one way to control that is just say, we set the quota at zero. Okay? Ban it outright. But when it comes to pollution, like carbon emissions or other types of emissions from cars, there's often an upper limit on what is permissible. Okay. Now, for positive externalities, it's harder to think of controlling behavior. Okay, requiring people to do things that cause positive externalities, at least for the government to require that. I mean, you could understand if, like, charity work provides a positive externality, your school could require that everyone do some community service. But it's hard to imagine the government requiring everyone must do community service. Um, you know, uh, a vaccination. Imagine the challenge of the government trying to require that everyone get vaccinated against COVID, right? Especially in the current political climate where there are some people who doubt the safety of vaccines. There are, many people who value their personal liberty. And so there are reasons why it would be difficult for the government to control vaccines and require vaccines. Now, your school can require vaccines. I imagine Elon does for like the traditional things, measles, mumps, rubella, um, etc. Okay, and in the future, require vaccination against COVID. The government, so this is interesting. The government does have like legal authority to require vaccinations. This has been done. This has been exercised in the past for smallpox and polio. Like it or not, you're going to get vaccinated against smallpox. Okay, no one has been vaccinated against smallpox in the U.S. There's been no vaccination program for 50 years. But prior to that, the government did establish like this is a requirement. Okay, and so government has that power. It's just politically difficult to require people to do things that benefit others. Okay, hell, I guess the masks and mask mandates would be a great example of the difficulty of requiring people, but it is more or less a requirement, like a control on what people consume, right? You must consume one mask when you're out in public. Okay, now the other set of controls that the government has, controls on prices. And essentially two types of controls. Just a second. Taxes on things that create negative externalities, or the reverse of a tax is a subsidy. Okay? Like a tax is something where the consumer or producer gives money to the government in order to consume or produce. A subsidy is where the consumer or producer receives money from the government in order to consume or produce. Okay, so one idea for dealing with negative externalities is a corrective tax. Okay? So tax the behavior that causes the negative externality. And as economists, we have a prediction. What will happen if you raise the price of a good? If we add a tax onto smoking cigarettes that raises the price of smoking cigarettes, according to the law of demand, people will smoke fewer cigarettes, right? People will purchase fewer cigarettes. That's actually one way of indirectly controlling consumption. Yeah. So perhaps instead of controlling, like putting a hard limit on consumption, we could tax the polluting behaviors or the behaviors causing negative externalities. And in fact, this is done in numerous situations. Cigarettes, I brought that up as an example of something that are very heavily taxed. Why? Because of the negative externalities that they cause. When I was in college, I think you could buy cheap cigarettes for under $1 a pack. Okay? You're raising your eyebrows. Yeah. I have no idea what the cheapest cigarettes would be now. $5 a pack? Is that? I know. Oh, heck. Most of you are underage, so you don't know. I'll check it out next time I go to the gas station. Anyhow, you know, cigarettes are taxed very heavily, and that's in North Carolina. Sorry, where the price might be $5 a pack. North Carolina is, of course, a very tobacco-friendly state. Okay? I think in places like New York City, there are minimum prices for cigarettes. I can't remember what those are, but put the prices of cigarettes at $10 and up, a pack of cigarettes at $10 and up. Okay, it's an example of essentially what we call a corrective tax. Um, let's see. Other examples: alcohol. Alcohol is in most states and in most developed countries taxed. In some countries, taxed heavily, especially in Northern Europe. The taxes on alcohol consumption are very high. North Carolina is really weird about the way it taxes alcohol. Now, does anyone here purchase alcohol legally? Yeah, okay. There's only one seller. There's actually a monopoly seller of hard liquor in North Carolina, and it's the state. Okay, all liquor stores in North Carolina and all hard liquor sales are done by the state, and these are at ABC stores. Is what liquor stores are called in North Carolina, Alcoholic Beverage Commission. And so essentially the price at the store is higher than presumably it would be on the free market because the government has added in a tax, or at least the extra, the government raises the price. And it's effectively the same as a tax that goes to the government. But in other states, where you might be able to purchase liquor at a private liquor store, or even, this blew my mind when I moved to Michigan, just seeing vodka being sold in the grocery market. I was like, wow, you can buy vodka in the grocery market at 4 a.m. on a Sunday. Okay, this doesn't happen in North Carolina. I think liquor stores are even closed on Sundays. And even on weekdays, they close at 9. Throughout the South, and so I'm originally from Texas, throughout the South, there are strict laws on alcohol consumption like that. Okay, it was just amazing that you could buy whatever you wanted at any time of the day at a supermarket. Okay, but again, taxes can be built into the price. Other examples of taxes, carbon emissions are taxed in some cases. Companies that produce carbon pay a carbon tax. And like it raises the cost of polluting or producing carbon, and so it reduces um, carbon emissions. Now, the perfect way to tax things is to tax according to the amount of the external damage that's caused. And then it could even be the case, okay, so if you tax according to the external damage caused, like go back to my example, if you think back to my example where there was $40 of negative externality caused by consuming a widget. If you were to raise the price of a widget, the price that, say, consumers pay for a widget by $40, make them pay an extra $40 to the government, then it would reduce the amount that they choose to purchase back to actually the socially optimal level. Okay? They are, in effect, taking on the full cost of the external damage, and sometimes described as internalizing the externality. Okay, internalizing the externality. So if I am forced to pay an amount equal to the damage that I cause to other people, it's no longer really an external cost. Like, it's no longer external damage. I now take on all that cost myself. Okay, and so, internal being the opposite of external, internalizing. And we could even, this is sort of the second part that I wrote down here for a corrective tax, we could even use that tax revenue to compensate people who are injured. Okay, so if my consuming a widget causes $40 of damage to, I don't know, to you all as a group, then we make me pay an extra $40 in tax for consuming the widget. Then that money gets divided up among you all, and it offsets the damage to you. Okay? So you end up like it's a wash for you. You've been compensated for the damage. You experienced some environmental damage, but you got some cash that was an equivalent amount. You're good. Okay? Me, I got my widget, I paid a tax, and it covered the external damage. So that corrective tax would be efficient. Okay, it restores like or it results in consumers and producers consuming and producing the socially optimal quantity, and it prevents anyone from getting damaged by the externality, right? at least you're damaged, but you're compensated an equivalent amount, right? So the third parties who are not part of the original transaction, they're not overall injured by the externality. And all of the external damage gets passed on to me as a person, or me as the person consuming it. So that's the idea of a corrective tax. Now, economists love this idea, and subsidies for creating positive externalities. Um, so, if something causes damage, penalize people for that. If something causes benefit to others, pay them to do it. So the government could remember the beehives that were benefiting neighboring orchards, fruit orchards. The government could ideally tax orchards that are next to bee farms and then pay a subsidy to bee farmers. And this would encourage, bless you, encourage more beekeeping and pass on the benefit, like the external benefit of beekeeping, that it resulted in more revenue for the farmers. That gets internalized. It's given back to the beekeepers. Okay. Now, this idea, as I said, economists love this idea of subsidizing good behaviors, like this. Okay, this is from the. This is an idea that was shared through or was posted by the Brookings Institution, which is an economic think tank, sort of left of center in its orientation. Want herd immunity? Pay people to take the vaccine. Okay, yeah, it's this idea that we could encourage people to get vaccinated and get vaccinated sooner if we give out like money for it, right? Right now, you all are thinking about, well, yeah, I'll probably get vaccinated. Probably most of you are in the group, or most of you are the types of people that you want to get vaccinated, and you want to get vaccinated sooner rather than later. But if the government paid money, it would certainly give you incentive to get it done pretty soon. And even if you had been in the group where you're like, nah, I don't want a vaccine, I don't want stuff injected into me, I'll just let other people provide me with herd immunity, like everyone else gets vaccinated, there's no one for me to catch it from, so I don't need to get injected, I'll let other people do that. But hey, if we're talking about $1,000 to get that shot, you might change your mind. Okay, so this comes from the Brookings Institution. Now, I mentioned this. This was a piece in the New York Times. Um, pay people to get vaccinated, and you see the author of that, right? By N. Gregory Mankiw. Okay, and Greg's a right of center person. He's fairly conservative. So you see economists sort of at like not radical ends of the political spectrum, but both the conservative and liberally oriented economists are in agreement that this is the way that we should encourage people to get vaccinated, instead of fighting over like, well, we can't get everyone to get vaccinated, and these complaints about personal liberty and a requirement infringing on that. Forget about that. I mean, it can still be a matter of personal liberty, but we pass on as cash money the benefit you're providing to other people. And Mankiw is actually pretty as I said, he's pretty conservative, but he favors, or he favored, sort of lockdowns for a very simple economic reason, that the main cause of economic damage during the COVID pandemic was not the lockdowns themselves. It was instead that the sort of ongoing pandemic made people afraid to go out. Okay, so there were restaurants being closed because of the pandemic. People couldn't sit down and enjoy an indoor meal at full capacity. But even if there had been no restrictions, a lot of the customers would not go into restaurants. And I'm sure plenty of you can imagine that as well. When's the next time that you're going to go into, I don't know, the thing that frightens me is being in an elevator with strangers. Movie theaters, restaurants, um, buses, subways. Okay, it's really so. Really, what will Mankiw's perspective, which I believe is correct, is that what will benefit the economy the most is reducing the fear of COVID infection. And so, along those lines, pay people to get vaccinated, and it will provide more economic benefit than the cost of the program. Okay, so I'm going to finish up there.